The fluorescent lights hummed their monotonous song as Laura Bennett moved through the ICU at Cedar Creek Medical, her scrubs 2 sizes too large, the fabric hanging loose enough to conceal what lay beneath, scars mapped across her forearms like a topography of survival. Colorado Springs morning light filtered through the sealed windows. She didn't look up as she passed the nurse's station. She didn't need to. Her eyes had already catalogued the room: 3 exits, oxygen points at bed 1 and bed 7, crash cart positioned 18 feet from the central monitor, defibrillator pads within arm's reach of the medication lock. The assessment took 3 seconds. She looked like every other competent new hire on a Tuesday. Dr. Mercer watched from behind the shift report, his tailored Patagonia vest pristine against his starched white coat, a man whose power was measured in credential plaques and departmental budget allocation. He flipped through her employment file with the casual dismissal of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in every room. RN Laura Bennett. 3 years at Johns Hopkins. 2 years at Seattle General. References glowing enough to be suspicious. No advanced certifications. No obvious red flags. Just another competent floor nurse filling a gap in the rotation. He didn't notice how she lingered near the supply closet during the 11 p.m. count, clipboard in hand, or how her gaze moved across inventory like she was reading a language only she understood. He certainly didn't notice her fingers brushing against the folded flag in her scrub pocket during quiet moments, the fabric worn soft from handling, edges creased from months of careful folding, the colors faded to the color of old bruises. The morning shift handoff began at 6:56 a.m. Nurses gathered around the central monitor, the senior resident rattling through patient updates with the practice monotone of someone who'd delivered the same information 400 times. Laura stood at the back, hands folded in front of her, projecting the kind of invisible competence that made supervisors forget to use your name. She was exactly what hospitals needed: present without demanding presence, reliable without requiring recognition. When Dr. Mercer glanced in her direction, he saw a quiet woman taking notes. He didn't see the way her eyes tracked the attending physician's body language, noting tension in his shoulders that suggested a conflict higher up the chain. He didn't see her lips move almost imperceptibly as she counted the machines on each monitor. Her voice, when she spoke, came soft and deferential. 7 patients on my team. The question was careful, almost apologetic. Mercer nodded without really looking at her. Of course she had 7 patients. Everyone had 7 patients. She was just another competent nurse doing unremarkable work in an unremarkable way. But competence was tactical. It was how you moved through a system without triggering alarms. It was how you embedded yourself so completely that nobody bothered to ask why you were photographing medication lot numbers at 2 a.m. Nobody questioned the new nurse who stayed late reviewing supply manifests, matching vendor names against purchase orders, cross-referencing delivery dates with payment records. Naval intelligence didn't send officers into field hospitals in Helmand Province just to hand out painkillers. They certainly didn't embed them in civilian hospitals in Colorado Springs to push paper. Somewhere in the supply chain that fed American military medical facilities, money was moving in directions that didn't align with patient care. The Pentagon had noticed discrepancies. $7 million in the last fiscal year. Equipment that never arrived. Vendors that didn't exist. And Cedar Creek Medical, which handled contracts for 3 military medical networks spanning the Southwest, sat directly in the center of that network. Laura pulled up the patient charts on the central monitor at 7:15 a.m., her fingers moving with methodical precision. Bed 1, post-op hip replacement, stable vitals, pain management protocol. Bed 3, pneumonia, antibiotics holding, fever trending down. Bed 5, cardiac observation, previous MI, EKG normal. The data moved across the screen in neat columns of numbers and abbreviations, and she absorbed it all with the calm focus of someone who'd read medical charts in places where the nearest CT scanner was 47 kilometers away. Her eyes lingered on bed 7. The patient had been admitted at 11:06 p.m. the night before, transferred from Denver Trauma Center with a notation that made her hands go still: shrapnel wounds, multiple lacerations, soldier, non-active duty status. She opened his full file. Admiral James Kellerman. 47 years old. Former field medic, Helmand Province, discharged 2018, private security contractor post-separation. Her jaw tightened just enough that only she would notice it was tighter. She pulled up his trauma notes. Explosive device. Vehicle IED. Injuries consistent with blast fragmentation. The descriptions were clinical, precise, identical to the one she'd written out 100 times in sand and darkness with limited supplies and the sound of helicopters in the distance. She approached bed 7 with the demeanor of someone delivering routine morning care. Vitals check. Chart review. For assessment. The man in the bed had dark hair graying at the temples, the kind of weathered tan that came from years of sun exposure in specific geographic regions, and a stillness in his eyes that told her everything about what he'd survived. His hand had small scars across the knuckles. His left shoulder moved slightly stiffly, old shrapnel wound that hadn't healed completely. As she adjusted his fore, her voice came soft and professional. "Good morning, Admiral. I'm Laura, your floor nurse today. How's your pain level?" He looked at her for a moment longer than necessary, and she felt the weight of his assessment. Combat medics learned to read people. They had to. Reading wrong got people killed. His answer came steady. "Manageable. Thank you." She nodded, made a note on the chart, moved to check his oxygen saturation. The monitor read 96%. Strong. Stable. Everything was exactly as it should be, which was the only reason her hand stayed steady as she touched the flag in her pocket, fingers finding the fold she could have found in absolute darkness after months of repetitive contact, the way muscle memory worked in small motions nobody else would ever notice. Dr. Mercer appeared at the nurse's station at 7:52 a.m. with his customary air of controlled superiority. He was the kind of administrator who'd risen through the ranks not because he was the best clinician, he was competent but not brilliant, but because he understood how to navigate institutional power. The hospital's profit margins. The insurance company relationships. The budgets that got approved and the ones that got quietly cut. He carried a tablet, and his gaze moved across the ICU with the satisfied look of a man reviewing his domain. When his eyes landed on Laura, already 3 hours into her shift and moving between patients with practiced efficiency, he felt nothing in particular. She was doing her job. The patients were stable. The monitors were beeping their reassuring rhythms. Everything was as it should be. He didn't notice how she'd already flagged 2 supply orders that didn't align with actual patient consumption. He didn't see the way her eyes had lingered on the purchasing request for 4 fluid bags, specifically, how the quantity ordered exceeded what the hospital actually used by approximately 34%, month after month, running into numbers that accumulated to something that looked very much like systematic overcharge. The morning moved forward with the rhythm of hospital work. Rounds at 8 a.m. Doctor presentations. Laura stood in the background during grand rounds, silent, taking notes, contributing nothing that would make her memorable. A perfect employee. Invisible. By 10 a.m., she'd begun the systematic process of photographing documentation in the supply closet during her break. Her phone moved with practiced steadiness, angles calculated to capture lot numbers and vendor information without triggering any security equipment that might have been mounted in less obvious locations. The work was patient. It was methodical. It was exactly the kind of embedding operation that naval intelligence had trained her for over 16 months of preparation before she'd ever set foot in Colorado Springs. By noon, she'd accessed the hospital's internal purchasing database using the credentials that had been provided during onboarding, credentials that had been specifically designed to give her access to exactly the right level of information without raising any flags with IT security. The data was moving. The patterns were becoming visible. Somewhere in this system, money was being diverted. Supplies were being inflated. The vendor addresses didn't exist. The delivery confirmations were falsified. And Admiral James Kellerman, lying in bed 7 with shrapnel wounds that should never have happened if the supply chain had been functioning properly, represented exactly the kind of consequence that happened when medical equipment got diverted somewhere else, replaced with substandard alternatives or simply never arrived at all. Laura finished her documentation at 2 p.m., her shift ending without incident, nothing remarkable about her departure. She moved past Dr. Mercer one final time, and he offered a polite nod, already reviewing the next chart, already calculating the next budget variance. She was competent. She was forgettable. She was exactly the kind of nurse that hospitals needed and that nobody ever really thought about once the shift ended. He had no idea that in her scrub pocket, beside the folded flag, she carried 3 photographs of falsified purchase orders. He had no idea that the quiet woman who'd just walked out of his ICU had survived 473 combat emergency interventions in a province 7,800 miles away. He had no idea that Admiral Kellerman in Bed 7 would open his eyes tomorrow and recognize something in her, the way someone moved, the tactical precision of her assessments, something in the set of her shoulders that spoke to training most civilian nurses would never possess. What he didn't know was that everything he'd built on the foundation of his corruption was about to be examined by someone who'd learned to see through systems in places where the cost of failure wasn't a budget variance, it was body bags. The Grand Rounds Assembly filled Cedar Creek Medical's auditorium like a Roman Colosseum, 40 physicians and residents arranged in tiered seating, their white coats creating a wall of institutional authority. Dr. Mercer stood at the podium with the confident posture of a man who'd never been questioned, a thick presentation folder open before him, his voice carrying the clinical precision of someone about to eviscerate a reputation with peer-reviewed language. "Our little Florence Nightingale here," he began, gesturing toward Laura, who stood motionless beside him in her scrubs, "decided a patient didn't need the catheterization I ordered. Never mind my 20 years of clinical experience. Never mind that I've successfully managed 17,000 cardiac interventions. She simply knew better." The room shifted. Heads turned. Laura's hands folded in front of her, knuckles pale, her expression flat as winter stone. She didn't look at Mercer. Didn't look at the 40 physicians studying her like a specimen under glass. Her jaw clenched once, almost imperceptible, the trembling that lived in the space between rage and control. Not fear. Never fear. Just the knowledge that staying silent cost something, and she was choosing to pay it. "Patient H, a 4847, Mercer continued, clicking through images on the screen behind him. 74-year-old male admitted 3 days ago with acute coronary syndrome. My assessment, immediate catheterization for stent placement, full angiography panel. The procedure would have generated approximately $8,000 in billable intervention codes." He paused, letting the specificity hang in the air like a test question. Instead, Nurse Bennett here decided to question my clinical judgment. She reviewed his imaging independently. She consulted with cardiology without my knowledge. She convinced the patient to pursue conservative management with pharmaceutical intervention. Laura's fingers pressed into the fabric of her scrubs. $8,000. She'd seen that exact amount listed on purchase orders for trauma shears in Helmand, the real cost may be $100. She'd seen supply theft fund insurgent operations. She'd watched systems fail because corruption had rotted them from inside. The patient survived, Mercer said, his tone dripping condescension, as if survival were incidental to his genius. His ejection fraction improved. No sepsis. No infection. Discharged to home care after 72 hours. He looked directly at Laura. Which is precisely what makes this behavior so dangerous. Nurse Bennett has a pattern of inserting herself into physician decision-making. Questioning treatment protocols. Reviewing supply orders beyond her scope of practice. 3 days ago, she was observed in the records department at 11:51 p.m., accessing billing codes related to medical supplies. When asked, she provided no documentation authorizing her presence. The room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum their electric drone, a sound like something dying slowly in the walls. "This is what we call a hero complex," Mercer continued, his voice taking on the pedagogical tone of a teacher instructing slow students. "It manifests as the conviction that established protocols exist to constrain superior judgment. The nurse believes she knows better than the system. Better than the physicians who trained for an additional 12 years beyond her 2-year credential. This behavior, if left unchecked, creates liability. Patient safety incidents. Medication errors. Protocol violations that expose Cedar Creek Medical to regulatory action. He clicked to his final slide, the list of 17 items, each one highlighted in clinical red, each one framed as an infraction. Laura's breath came steady and measured, the breathing cadence she'd learned in tactical insertion trainings, the one that kept heart rate stable during incoming fire. She counted the items without looking. 17 documented violations in 3 days. He'd been thorough. He'd been watching her like a predator, calculating the optimal moment to strike. When Mercer finally paused for breath, his chest rising with the satisfaction of a man who believed he'd won, Laura's voice cut through the silence with surgical precision. "Strange how the patients you criticize me about keep leaving here alive and uninfected," she said quietly, her words carrying the weight of someone who'd watched people die from preventable causes. "While your unit average for post-procedural sepsis runs at 4.7%. Double the national standard for cardiac intervention. That's statistically significant, Doctor. That's a pattern the hospital's Quality Assurance Committee should be examining." The room didn't just go silent. It crystallized into something harder, something with edges. Mercer's face flushed a shade of cardiac tissue, deep red, approaching purple. "You're out of line, Nurse Bennett." "I'm stating hospital data," Laura replied, turning and walking toward the ICU entrance without waiting for dismissal. Her footsteps echoed on the polished tile with the measured cadence of someone departing a combat briefing, unhurried, unafraid. "The data's available through the hospital performance portal. Any physician in this room can access it. You should review your numbers, Doctor." She didn't hear his response. The ICU doors closed behind her with their hydraulic hiss, cutting off the beginning of what sounded like an explanation that no one would believe. 2 hours later, after charting vitals and monitoring post-procedure patients, Laura was at the vending machine on the 4th floor when his shadow fell across the fluorescent-lit rows of drinks and snacks. Dr. Mercer. And behind him, positioned at a careful distance, Tony from hospital security, close enough to observe, far enough to maintain plausible deniability. "You think you're some kind of hero, RN Bennett?" Mercer's voice had lost the pedagogical tone. What remained was raw contempt, the voice of a man whose carefully constructed hierarchy had just been publicly questioned. "You're a liability. A dangerous, independent little nurse playing detective." Laura selected a ginger ale without responding, her hand steady as she inserted the dollar bill and made her selection. The machine hummed, a sound like distant rotor blades. "I've been documenting everything," Mercer continued, his proximity closing until she could smell coffee on his breath, the bitter acidic smell of ambition brewing into something toxic. "Every time you access a patient chart beyond your clinical assignment. Every supply closet visit. Every late-night appearance in the records department. The hospital has a clear documentation trail of protocol violations. At will employment, Nurse Bennett. You won't last the week." His hand moved toward her shoulder, not quite touching, but close enough that the threat was anatomical, territorial. Laura stepped back, placing the vending machine between them with the casual precision of someone adjusting a piece of equipment. She met his eyes with that frozen stare, the expression that had once made a helm and provincial governor reconsider his position on the location of weapons caches. No anger visible on her face. No fear. No protest. Just the clear-eyed assessment of a predator recognizing a competitor. Her right hand moved to her scrub pocket, touching the folded flag there, cotton worn thin by months of being carried through desert dust, through rain in the Hindu Kush mountains, through hospital corridors in countries where supply corruption meant body bags. Corpsman James Davies. Bronze Star. 2 combat tours. Bled out from a femoral artery wound on patrol in Sanjan Valley because the tourniquets distributed to his unit had defective webbing, part of a shipment routed through a phantom vendor company that saved exactly $200 per unit by eliminating quality control testing. Dr. Mercer's brother-in-law owned a medical supply company. The math completed itself. "Smart girl," Mercer said, turning to leave, his confidence restored by what he perceived as her submission. "Keep your head down this week, and maybe I'll recommend they let you resign quietly instead of terminating for cause." Laura watched him walk away, her hand still in her pocket, touching fabric that held the weight of institutional failure. She'd recognized the pattern now, the complete, crystalline pattern of how systems fed on themselves. Mercer had noticed her reviewing billing codes that first night, the ones that revealed his systematic inflation of supply costs through his brother-in-law's phantom vendor accounts. She'd been documenting for naval intelligence, building the case that would eventually trigger the Pentagon audit. But to him, she was simply a nurse who'd stumbled onto evidence that could cost him everything. A $12 million threat walking around in scrubs, processing data through systems he'd corrupted to their foundation. He was escalating now. The public humiliation at Grand Rounds had been stage 1, social attack, meant to undermine her credibility with the medical community so no one would listen if she raised concerns about his numbers. The vending machine confrontation was stage 2, strategic intimidation, weaponizing hospital policy and his security liaison position to create a documented record of her supposed violations while simultaneously warning her to stop investigating. He was building the case that would justify her termination before the audit arrived. But he'd made a mistake. He'd shown her his hand too early. He'd revealed exactly what he was protecting and why, and she was embedded here with the training to map the entire corruption network. The Navy didn't deploy intelligence officers to track single perpetrators. They deployed them to unravel systems. She inserted another dollar bill into the vending machine and selected a bottle of water. The machine dispensed it with mechanical precision, and Laura took it back to the ICU where Admiral James Kellerman lay sedated in bed 7, his chest rising and falling with the assistance of machines, his presence here no accident at all. The next thing that would happen would be fire. The smoke detectors screamed at 1423. One continuous shriek that bent the air itself, then another, then a third as the alarm cascaded through Cedar Creek Medical's ICU wing like a siren warning of invasion. Laura heard it first. That particular frequency cuts through normal hearing, travels at a speed that bypasses the conscious mind and hits something older. She was checking Admiral Kellerman's sedation levels when the ventilation system began pushing out plumes of black smoke like a dragon waking from centuries of sleep. Electrical fire. Server room. The words crackled through the overhead intercom, but Laura already knew. Smoke doesn't lie. Smoke doesn't negotiate. It moves with the inevitability of inevitability itself, and in a hospital built in 1987 with ventilation ducts that hadn't been properly serviced since the Clinton administration, smoke moves fast. The first nurse to react was Jeremy from the day shift, who hit the alarm pull station and then stood motionless, watching the smoke billow as if it might politely reverse direction if he stared hard enough. The second was Marcus, who grabbed the crash cart and rolled it toward the door, away from the smoke, away from responsibility, toward somewhere that felt safer. The charge nurse, Patricia, was on the phone with facilities screaming about evacuation protocols while her hands trembled. No one was moving the patients yet. No one had made the decision to move them yet. That space between awareness and action, that gap, stretched like taffy. Laura didn't waste it. She moved toward bed 7 where Admiral Kellerman lay sedated, still recovering from the shrapnel wounds that had brought him through those glass doors 4 days ago. His chest rose and fell with mechanical precision courtesy of the ventilator, his lungs pushing air through tubes designed to keep him alive in moments of crisis. The smoke was rolling in now, thick as wool, smelling of burning insulation and ozone, that sharp metallic taste that gets in your teeth and stays there for days. She could see it gathering at the ceiling, pushing downward like fog trying to suffocate the room. The monitor showed his oxygen saturation dropping. 97, 94. 91, the numbers falling like a stone through water. Laura's hands moved on their own. Not hesitation. Not thought. Muscle memory from 100 field interventions in Helmand Province, from trauma bays under fire, from moments when the only thing between living and dying was speed and absolute certainty. She grabbed the emergency equipment from the crash cart, the needle she would need, the syringe for aspiration. She palpated his ribs with her left hand, finding the landmarks, second intercostal space, midclavicular line. Her fingers knew this anatomy like a pianist knows a keyboard. The needle went in. 14-gauge angiocath, smooth and sharp, sliding between the ribs like it was meant to be there. The hiss of air escaping. That's the sound of relief. That's the sound of a collapsed lung decompressing, of pressure releasing, of the body's internal mechanisms realigning themselves toward survival. His oxygen saturation climbed. 92, 95. 98, sinus rhythm steady on the monitor. The ventilator's wheeze became something almost musical. The smoke kept coming. She could see it now at the foot of the bed, rolling across the linoleum like an invading army. Her eyes were watering. The other patients, 6 of them scattered across the ICU, were being moved now, Jeremy and Marcus pushing stretchers with the urgency of men who finally understood the weight of consequence. But the smoke was faster. The smoke was always faster. Laura stood between the Admiral and the encroaching grey, her stained scrubs clinging to her body, her hair escaping from under her surgical cap, her jaw set the way it got when everything essential distilled itself down to the single moment she was living in. She did not cough. She did not move. She did not remove her hands from the line until she was certain it was patent and secure. Then she opened the medication port and pushed 2 milligrams of midazolam to keep him sedated through the evacuation. Professional. Efficient. The kind of calm that comes from having already survived worse things than smoke. She was still standing there when the facilities team arrived to begin wheeling him out, when Jeremy returned to help, when the intercom announced a full evacuation of the ICU and all personnel should proceed to the south stairwell with their assigned patients. She stepped back and let them move him. She did not announce what she'd done. She did not explain the needle mark or the decompression or the syringe she'd used without a physician's order standing beside her with a pen in hand to sign off. She had broken protocol 17 times. Dr. Mercer arrived 20 minutes later. The smoke had been contained to the server room and the main ICU corridor. The building's fire suppression system had done its job, though the hospital would spend 17 months and $4.2 million investigating the electrical malfunction that triggered it. But Dr. Mercer didn't come to discuss infrastructure failures. He came with hospital administration. He came with a folder thick enough to require both hands to carry. Laura was still in the ICU when they arrived, still in the smoke-stained scrubs, helping Patricia verify that every piece of equipment had been properly documented for insurance purposes. The intercom had announced an all-clear 30 minutes prior. The evacuation had been textbook. Everyone had lived. Dr. Mercer's voice arrived before he did. That particular tenor, smooth as silk wrapped around a blade, carried down the hallway and made every spine within earshot straighten reflexively. The chief nursing officer followed him, along with the director of risk management, a woman named Susan Chow who had the particular expression of someone who'd spent her entire career burying institutional liabilities under layers of bureaucratic protocol. R.N. Bennett. He said it the way a prosecutor says, Your Honor. The title was a tool in his hand, already sharpened. We need to discuss what occurred during the evacuation. He opened the folder before she could respond. Laura could see the documentation from where she stood, incident reports with witness statements, the kind of paperwork that accumulates like sediment when someone is building a case. His finger traced the highlighted sections, his voice carrying the weight of manufactured concern, the kind that sounds sympathetic while describing catastrophe. According to the statements from Jeremy Whitmore and Marcus Chen, you performed needle decompression on Admiral Kellerman without a physician's order. He looked up, his eyes the color of a winter sky, cold and clear and absolutely certain of their rightness. That's Procedure 17 in the violation list. Unauthorized intervention during medical emergency. Failure to maintain chain of command. Direct physician scope encroachment. The CNO shifted her weight. She was new, only 3 months into the position, and the weight of hierarchy was visible in her shoulders like a physical burden. Mercer sat on the hospital board. He had been here for 14 years. He had mentored 3 generations of residents. His word carried the particular gravity of institutional history. You also directed the evacuation of Bed 3 and Bed 5 without waiting for nursing supervisory approval, Mercer continued, turning another page. That's protocol violation number 8. Chain of custody issues on the medication log, you pushed sedatives without a counter-signature. Protocol violation number 12. Your scope as an RN does not include independent medication administration during emergencies without concurrent physician presence. Each accusation landed like a gavel strike. Laura could see the architecture of it now, the way he'd built this case like a house of cards that somehow wouldn't collapse. He'd been waiting for this. Waiting for her to do exactly what protocol demanded she do, knowing that saving a life would require her to shatter the very rules designed to protect institutional liability. Smoke-stained scrubs. Evidence of intervention. Witnesses who would confirm she'd acted without authorization. The hospital's risk management protocols are clear, Mercer said, his voice dropping into something almost paternal. Nurses have a crucial role to play, but that role exists within specific boundaries. When those boundaries are transgressed, however well-intentioned, we have exposure. Liability. Potential Joint Commission violations. As much as we appreciate your initiative, Captain, sorry, RN Bennett, we can't overlook this. He wasn't being cruel. That was the genius of it. He was being reasonable. Professional. Concerned about the hospital's well-being. He was a man protecting institutional interests, and institutional interests always sound reasonable when spoken by someone with enough power behind their words. Susan Chow asked if she had anything to say. It was the procedural moment. The one where the accused gets to defend themselves before the machinery of institutional consequence begins turning. Laura looked at Admiral Kellerman's empty bed, the one she could see from where she stood, the one with the ventilator rolled away now and the sheets already being changed by housekeeping. She looked at the monitor that had shown his oxygen climbing. She looked at Dr. Mercer's satisfied expression, the particular confidence of a man who'd just moved a piece across a board and was absolutely certain it couldn't be moved back. She could tell them the truth. She could explain about her military medical training, the 6 years in Helmand Province, the 473 combat interventions logged in a classified file at SOAR headquarters that would prove she'd operated at a level beyond civilian nursing scope her entire career. But telling the truth meant blowing the cover, burning the investigation into his phantom vendor fraud, the $12 million in supply chain corruption that had filtered defective equipment to military hospitals across 3 states. 6 other investigations. $18 million in uncovered fraud. Soldiers who'd died from tourniquets that wouldn't hold. Medics who'd had to improvise with equipment that shouldn't have made it past a warehouse inspection. Her handler's voice was in her ear, even though her handler wasn't in the room. The contingency protocols. The abort sequence. The one that meant walking away meant others would die later because the system wouldn't get fixed. No, she said. Her voice was level. Professional. The voice of a nurse who understood the boundaries of her scope. Nothing to add. She turned in her badge at 16:02. The lanyard was light in her hands, almost weightless, as if by relinquishing it she'd also relinquished whatever force had been holding her in place. The badge itself was cheap plastic and a photograph from her hiring day, back when she'd still thought she could be both things, a nurse and a soldier, a healer and an investigator. Turns out the universe didn't allow for that kind of simultaneity. It forced you to choose. It forced you to walk away from one truth to protect another. She turned in her scrubs. She packed her locker. She didn't say goodbye to Patricia or Jeremy or any of the nurses who'd worked beside her for these 3 weeks that had felt like 3 months compressed into the density of a crisis. The parking lot was empty except for her truck and the Colorado Springs evening settling down around the city like a blanket made of cooling air and the particular kind of silence that follows when you've burned something you can't rebuild. She sat in the parking lot for 7 minutes with her hands on the steering wheel, not moving, not thinking, just breathing in the thin Colorado evening while the sun burned orange against the western ridge. The scrubs in the bag beside her still smelled like antiseptic and smoke, the chemical ghost of what she'd walked away from. Not the fire. Not the hospital. The mission. 6 months of work. 6 months embedding herself in Cedar Creek systems, photographing invoices under the guise of filing insurance denials, cross-referencing supply orders with vendors who existed only on paper, building a case that would have exposed Dr. Mercer's $12 million phantom procurement scheme before the Navy's quarterly audit could ask questions about why trauma supplies were costing 3 times what they should. 6 months of sitting in break rooms with Patricia and Jeremy, listening to complaints about Dr. Mercer's arrogance, nodding at conversations she filed away for the intelligence report she'd never write now. And she'd burned it. Burned all of it. For one patient. For one admiral. The rules were explicit. Do not compromise the operation. Do not reveal yourself. Do not engage in heroics that draw attention. The Navy didn't embed operatives into civilian hospitals so they could save individual lives. They embedded them to expose systemic corruption that cost soldiers their lives in ones and twos across deployment after deployment. Admiral Kellerman should have been a name in a report, not a reason to violate operational parameters. But he'd been a medic. And the fire had filled his lungs with smoke that his traumatized lung couldn't process, and his oxygen sat had crashed to 68%, and the moment she'd recognized what was happening, tension pneumothorax, the same injury she'd treated in Helmand Province 147 times, her hands had moved before her mind could argue. 1 needle. 14-gauge angiocath at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. The hiss of air escaping from his chest cavity. Oxygen climbing, 72, 78, 84. Recovery of a human being who shouldn't have died on her watch. And now she needed to explain how a civilian nurse knew combat trauma medicine. She turned in her badge at shift change, walked into HR with her resignation letter already typed, resignation without cause, no opportunity for Cedar Creek to investigate, no time for HR to ask questions about her background or wonder why she'd suddenly decided 2 near-fatal episodes were her breaking point. They'd been happy to process it. Dr. Mercer had probably made sure of it. One less variable in his carefully constructed image management. The badge clattered softly on the HR desk. The woman processing it, a tired-looking administrator named Susan, had barely looked up. Laura had been there 3 weeks. In Cedar Creek's accounting, she was a statistic. A short-term hire. A problem resolved. Nobody asked about the man she'd saved. Nobody asked about the fire. Nobody asked why her resignation was hand-delivered instead of emailed from her apartment like a normal person with advance notice. The hospital was already moving forward, already typing the incident report that would conveniently omit her medical intervention and focus instead on the structural failures that had caused the electrical malfunction. Dr. Mercer would ensure the narrative stayed clean. Blame the building's antiquated wiring. Blame the maintenance contractor. Blame anything except the nurse who'd saved the Admiral's life in direct violation of her job description. The truck's interior had cooled as the sun dropped lower. Laura started the engine, pulled out of Cedar Creek's parking lot, and drove through Colorado Springs with the kind of careful attention that came from operating in spaces where mistakes got people killed. She obeyed every traffic law. She signaled every turn. She stayed in the slow lane and did nothing to draw attention. Her apartment was a furnished rental 3 blocks from the base, another piece of cover, chosen because civilians without military connections lived near the base in this part of Colorado Springs, and a nurse earning $58,000 a year would reasonably afford the neighborhood. She'd spent 18 nights there. The furniture still smelled like the rental company's plastic wrap. The bag of scrubs sat on her coffee table. She didn't put them in the hamper or drape them over a chair. She laid them flat on the glass surface, unfolded them one piece at a time, and refolded each garment with precise hospital corners, the way Cedar Creek's laundry service had shipped them to her, the way they expected them back. No wrinkles. No personal touches. Just clean fabric returned to its institutional state. The scrub top still held the shape of her shoulders. The scrub bottoms had a faint salt stain from sweat along the waistband. The underlying smell, beneath the antiseptic, was her own skin, her own history embedded in the cotton fibers. She'd worn these clothes for 3 weeks while someone else lived inside her body, while Captain Laura Bennett from Naval Intelligence became just another civilian contractor, competent but unremarkable, the kind of nurse doctors barely remembered. Except Admiral Kellerman would remember. He'd recognized her call sign the moment she'd opened his airway. And now the entire operation was burning. She folded the last scrub top and placed it in the Cedar Creek laundry bag, white cloth with blue embroidered lettering, sterile and anonymous. No identification. No reason for anyone to connect the returned scrubs to the nurse who'd walked away 3 hours earlier. On her nightstand sat the flag. Not a flag, exactly, a triangle of faded blue fabric, edges worn soft from 18 years of being handled by a man who couldn't let go of the death it represented. Corman Davies. 18 years old. Fallen outside of Sanjin Valley, Helmand Province, when a convoy had been hit by an IED fashioned from materials supplied by the same vendors Dr. Mercer was funneling money through now, just in civilian supply chains instead of military ones. The tourniquet that should have saved Davies's life had been defective. Rubber degraded. Ratchet mechanism loose. The investigation had found that the vendor had been substituting cheaper materials for 6 months before anyone noticed. 6 months. Dozens of soldiers. And the supplier was still getting military contracts because somebody in the logistics chain was getting paid to look the other way. Laura had gotten the flag at Davies's memorial service in 2006. His mother had pressed it into her hands and said, "You finished the work he couldn't." 18-year-old's final mission had become a career. She picked up the flag and set it on her nightstand beside her military ID. The ID she hadn't used in 6 months. The one that would have been her only defense if she'd needed to explain her knowledge, her training, her muscle memory that had turned her into a life-saving machine the moment the fire started. But explaining meant revealing. Revealing meant compromising Admiral Kellerman, who'd only been in Cedar Creek because the Navy needed him somewhere safe while they figured out what to do with a decorated officer who'd suffered psychological collapse after losing half his team to an IED made possible by the same supply chain corruption Laura was supposed to be investigating from inside the hospital system. Her phone buzzed. Text from her handler, coded in a language they'd established, status report. Update pending quarterly briefing. She didn't answer. The Navy had embedded her in Cedar Creek Medical to expose a $12 million fraud scheme. She'd accomplished the intelligence gathering, had the photographs, the invoice cross-references, the phantom vendor names and the bank account numbers waiting on an encrypted drive. But she'd also accomplished something else. She'd blown her cover on the operating floor of an ICU at 2:22 a.m. while her hand was on Admiral Kellerman's chest. The mission wasn't dead. It was compromised. Which in the world of naval intelligence meant approximately the same thing. She stood and walked to the window overlooking the street below. Colorado Springs evening had deepened to purple. A helicopter passed overhead, not unusual in this part of the city, where Fort Carson sprawled across the landscape like a sleeping giant. But she watched it anyway, tracking its path, reading the navigation lights, automatically assessing whether it was military or civilian. Civilian. CH-47 with a red stripe. Some contractor work. Back at Cedar Creek Medical, Dr. Mercer was probably celebrating in the risk management office, explaining to administrators how he'd dodged a liability bullet, how the nurse with the hero complex had voluntarily separated before she could cause more problems. He'd have documentation ready. Witness statements from the fire, all highlighting her protocol violations. Maybe a few comments about how she'd seemed unstable, prone to making independent decisions without consulting supervisors. He didn't know that every file he deleted from Cedar Creek's server at 2:11 a.m. 3 nights ago had been backed up to a secondary system the moment he'd triggered emergency access protocol. He didn't know that the IT director in the basement, James Chen, who wore a Desert Storm lapel pin and had 3 photographs of his daughter serving with the 82nd Airborne on his desk, had flagged the suspicious login and was probably watching the footage right now with the kind of cold certainty that came from having seen what supply chain corruption did to soldiers. Laura folded the Cedar Creek laundry bag closed, sealed it with the provided zip tie, and set it beside her apartment door. She'd return it tomorrow morning before her handler figured out what had happened. Before the Navy's quarterly audit reached Cedar Creek's files and discovered the $12 million in phantom procurement. She was going to lose her career. She was going to lose her clearance. She was probably going to lose her commission when this was finished, because you didn't blow a naval intelligence operation and walk away with a pension and a handshake. But Admiral Kellerman would wake up tomorrow morning and breathe oxygen that his lungs could process. And somewhere in Colorado Springs, the fraud investigation would continue without her, but it would continue. The supplies would be audited. The vendors would be traced. And maybe, just maybe, the next soldier who needed a tourniquet would get one that actually worked. She picked up her phone to answer her handler. But before she could unlock the screen, another text came through. Different number. Different code. 2 words, Admiral conscious. Situation developing. She set the phone on the nightstand beside the folded flag and sat in the darkness of her rental apartment, in the particular silence of someone who'd just burned everything and couldn't do anything now but wait for the consequences to arrive. Admiral James Kellerman's eyes opened on the 3rd morning, and for exactly 4 seconds his pupils tracked nothing, saw nothing, registered only the white ceiling and the steady beep of his own heart monitor. Then his gaze found the window. Found the corridor beyond. Found Laura in her civilian clothes at her locker, collecting the personal items she'd arrived with: a paperback thriller, a photograph in a plastic frame, the small leather journal where she'd documented every pattern of fraud she'd discovered. His voice came out papery, barely a rasp above the ventilator's mechanical rhythm: Reaper. 1 word. That was all. The Marine Corps liaison standing near his bed, Captain Chen, tattoo of a jump wing on his neck, posture like someone who'd walked through Kandahar without flinching, went absolutely still. He'd been reviewing discharge paperwork. Now his head turned toward the Admiral with the precision of a gun turret tracking. So. That nurse leaving, Kellerman whispered. That's Reaper. Helmand Province. 3 years of combat saves. She just resigned because of Mercer. Chen moved like someone whose muscle memory predated sleep. He pulled his phone from his pocket, tapped the hospital's directory, cross-referenced against Navy personnel databases. His face changed. Changed again. Changed a 3rd time as the data crystallized into something too large to be a coincidence. Captain Laura Bennett. Bronze Star with Valor. Navy Cross. 473 documented combat medical interventions in Helmand Province between 2014 and 2017. Her entire file was redacted except for the decorations and a single classified line, detached to naval intelligence operations as of August 2023 for sensitive investigation. Eyes only clearance SOCOM. Chen walked toward Dr. Mercer, who was arguing with hospital administration near the nurse station, his voice taking on that particular whine of a man who'd just realized his control was slipping. The liability exposure alone, Captain Bennett violated 17 protocols and I have documentation. Dr. Mercer. Chen's voice sounded like a steel door sliding shut. He held up his phone's screen. The display showed everything. Everything. You've been under federal investigation since her arrival. Captain Bennett was embedded here. And you just fired the Navy's most decorated combat medic to cover up your supply chain fraud. The color drained from Mercer's face like someone had pulled a plug. Within the hour, a Navy general arrived at Cedar Creek Medical in a dress uniform that looked like someone had pressed confidence into fabric. She rendered a salute to Laura, a full parade ground salute, fist to chest, the kind reserved for decorated officers, while Mercer stood frozen near the conference room, his mouth opening and closing like a fish in an aquarium. Captain Bennett, the general said. On behalf of SOCOM and Naval Intelligence, the United States Navy thanks you for your service. Mercer tried to interrupt. He opened his mouth. He tried again. But the words died because the hospital's IT director, a Desert Storm veteran named Marcus with scarred hands and the careful patience of someone who'd learned to document everything, was now displaying security footage across every monitor in the building. The footage showed Dr. Mercer in the server room at 2:04 a.m., 3 nights after Laura had accessed his phantom vendor files. His hands shaking. His face illuminated by monitor glow. He was deleting. Erasing. Frantically pulling files marked supply chain, vendor invoices, Hayes Medical Supply. His lips moved, he was talking to himself, muttering something about that bitch nurse and federal audit and I need this gone before Tuesday. But here was the part that ended his career. Every file he'd tried to destroy had been automatically backed up to a secondary Navy server the moment his access credentials triggered the emergency protocol. Nothing disappeared. Everything was archived. Documented. Preserved in federal storage with timestamps that matched his panicked deletion attempts frame by frame. Dr. Mercer, the general said quietly, you're looking at 18 counts of fraud. $12 million in false billing to the Department of Defense. And you just recorded yourself attempting to destroy evidence. Mercer's hand started to shake. I want my lawyer. Good idea, Chen said. The next 6 months moved like a legal avalanche. Mercer's brother-in-law, the one who'd actually run Hayes Medical Supply, the one who'd been billing for equipment that existed only on invoices, both entered guilty pleas. The plea agreement involved returning $8 million, accepting a permanent ban from healthcare, and teaching CPR classes at Community College of Colorado Springs for $11 an hour. The federal government considered that punishment sufficient for a man whose phantom invoices had meant real soldiers received defective tourniquets, compromised surgical supplies, equipment that failed in the field. Laura's body count in Helmand Province had stayed low because she'd known her supplies were reliable. Corpsman Marcus Davies' body count had not. Admiral Kellerman's retirement ceremony took place on a bright afternoon in late spring, flags snapping in the Colorado wind, a 21-gun salute that echoed across the parade grounds like distant thunder. Laura stood in Navy service dress blues, captain's bars gleaming bright as polished steel on her shoulders, the Navy cross hanging among her ribbons, visible now, no longer hidden beneath civilian scrubs and self-erasure. Her decorations caught the sunlight and threw it back like a promise. Through the open gates of the ceremony, Dr. Mercer walked past in a polo shirt with the community college logo embroidered on the chest. He carried textbooks about CPR guidelines and first aid protocols that he'd once had the arrogance to claim expertise in. He didn't look toward the ceremony. Didn't make eye contact. Just kept moving like a man walking through weather. Admiral Kellerman approached Laura after the formal speeches concluded, when the brass had finished shaking hands and the crowd was thinning. He moved slowly, the injury had healed but it had left him careful, deliberate, and when he reached her, he saluted first, then extended a gift wrapped in marine green paper. Inside was a tactical medical bag, midnight blue with white thread stitching, and embroidered across the front in letters that looked like they'd been hand-stitched was a single word, Reaper. For the next deployment, Kellerman said, I had someone track down your old team. They remembered you liked the call sign more than your real name. I think they were right. Laura's hand steadied on the bag strap. There's a next deployment. Chief of Medical Integrity Operations for Naval Medical Center San Diego, the general said, stepping forward with a formal folder. You'll be investigating supply chains across 18 military medical facilities. Starting immediately. Your job is to make sure what happened here never happens again. Every hospital. Every vendor. Every invoice. She handed Laura the folder. Full operational authority. And something else. A second gift. Smaller. A shadow box with marine varnish that would protect whatever lay inside from dust and time. The folded flag from Corpsman Marcus Davies, the one Laura had carried in her scrub pocket through every shift at Cedar Creek, the one she'd held in the darkness of her apartment while contemplating the sacrifice of someone else's life spent on her work, her mission, her choices. Now it was mounted under glass with a nameplate engraved in letters that would outlast them all, in memory of HM2 Marcus Davies, Helmand Province, 2015. Semper Fidelis. Beside the flag, a photograph of her Helmand Province team, 6 medics in combat gear, sun-darkened and serious, standing in front of a Marine Corps helicopter with the Hindu Kush Mountains in the background. Laura was visible in the back row, younger, harder, the kind of woman who hadn't yet learned that quiet people could move through the world invisible if they chose to. $40 million recovered, the general continued. 11 people indicted. 7 state fraud network dismantled. All because you kept working while everyone thought you were just a nurse. She smiled. Welcome back to active duty, Captain. The Navy's Inspector General shook her hand next, and then a succession of officers in dress uniforms, each one straightening slightly when they saw the Navy cross, each one saluting with a precision that said they understood. This was not a nurse. This had never been a nurse. This was a warrior who'd chosen medicine instead of guns, and the distinction meant everything. Laura walked through Naval Medical Center San Diego for the first time in her new role 3 weeks later. Nurses and doctors straightened as she passed, not because she'd ordered them to, not because she carried authority like a weapon. They straightened because word had gotten around. Because someone had finally explained who was really in the hallway. Because the woman in Captain's bars with the Navy Cross was the same person who'd saved the Admiral, and the hospital where she'd worked had been under federal investigation, and there'd been fraud, and there'd been justice, and someone had finally seen. Her office on the 3rd floor had windows facing the harbor. The shadow box with Corman Davies' flag hung on the wall behind her desk, directly in her line of sight, so that every time she reviewed a vendor invoice, every time she authorized a supply shipment, every time she made a decision that affected which medical equipment reached which soldiers, she'd see the face of someone who hadn't made it home. The folded flag meant, never again. The Navy Cross meant, it was possible to serve without carrying a weapon. The Captain's bars meant, the world finally knew what she was. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. If this story resonated with you, if you know the power of quiet people doing extraordinary work, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. Comment below, have you ever been massively underestimated by someone who didn't know your actual strength? What would you have done in Laura's position? And share this with someone who needs to know that real heroism doesn't always look like you expect it to look.